Julian Thorne was 48 years old with a fortune of $3.5 billion. Yet he had never found a woman who loved him for the man he was, not the name he carried. After 3 costly divorces and dozens of relationships built on opportunism, he decided to conduct an experiment that would change his life forever. He summoned 4 women to his penthouse overlooking Central Park. There was Isabella, the art gallery owner he had been seeing for months. There was Victoria, a rival CEO he had met during a tense merger negotiation. There was Chloe, the social media influencer he'd met at charity gala. And finally, there was Elena, the quiet, young woman from Brooklyn who had been working as a junior archivist in his family's foundation for the past year. To each, he presented a certified check for $1 million, explaining they had 24 hours to use it on something of true value. He was convinced they would all indulge in the kind of material excess he had come to expect. But what Elena did with that check would move him so deeply that he would weep for the first time in 2 decades, discovering that the one thing he couldn't buy had been within his reach all along. Julian had woken that November morning in his 10,000-square-foot penthouse, feeling the familiar weight of loneliness that had been his only constant companion for years. At 48, he had built a financial empire on Wall Street that was legendary, but every professional triumph was a monument to his personal failures. 3 marriages had ended in ruin, each with a woman who ultimately revealed her primary interest was his fortune. The first was to an actress who used his connections to launch her career before leaving him for a director. The second was to a socialite from an old money family who saw him merely as a way to fund her extravagant lifestyle. The third, and most bitter, was to a business partner who had feigned love for 3 years, only to attempt a hostile takeover of his company during their divorce proceedings. Now, single for 2 years, Julian was surrounded by beautiful but hollow women who pursued him for his status. He was tired of feeling like a walking bank vault, tired of doubting every smile, every touch, every declaration of love. That morning, as he drank the espresso brought to him by Elena, an idea took shape in his mind. He would conduct a test, a final experiment to reveal, once and for all, if there was a woman left in the world capable of love without an agenda. Elena Rossi was 28 years old and came from a world away in Brooklyn. She had worked for the Thorne Foundation for a year, always quiet and remarkably efficient. She had taken a job in Manhattan to support her family. Her father, a former construction worker, was sidelined by a chronic illness. Her mother worked 2 jobs, and her younger brother was just starting college. She wasn't beautiful by the razor-sharp runway standards Julian was accustomed to, but there was something in her eyes that intrigued him, a quiet integrity that seemed entirely out of place in his world of glittering surfaces. Julian then had his assistant call his 3 current interests. Isabella Dubois, 35, the chic owner of a contemporary art gallery in Soho. She was sophisticated, polished, and always impeccably styled. She had been courting him for 6 months with the clear objective of becoming the 4th Mrs. Thorne. Next was Victoria Chun, 40, the formidable CEO of a competing tech firm. A Wharton graduate who spoke fluent Mandarin, Victoria was a legend in her own right. She was as brilliant as she was ambitious, and she saw a union with Julian as the ultimate merger, a move to consolidate power at the apex of New York's financial world. Finally, there was Chloe Vance, 25, a model and influencer with 5 million followers on Instagram. She was the youngest and most physically spectacular of the 3, but also the most transparent in her intentions. She made no secret of her dream to live a life of luxury, filled with first-class travel and endless designer gifts. He asked each of them to present themselves at his penthouse at 4 p.m. for a unique proposition. Afterward, he walked over to Elena, who was organizing files in the foundation's small office, and asked if she, too, would be present for the meeting. At 4 o'clock on the dot, the private elevator doors opened, and the first 3 women arrived almost simultaneously. Isabella arrived in a chauffeured vintage Bentley, Victoria in a sleek black company Tesla, and Chloe in an ostentatious pink G-Wagon, a gift from a former boyfriend. All were impeccably dressed, radiating confidence and curiosity about the proposition. They settled into the grand salon, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the park, and walls hung with art that could finance a small country. Elena stood stiffly by the door, still wearing her simple work blouse, utterly confused as to why Julian had asked her to stay. Julian entered carrying a polished mahogany box. Inside, resting on velvet, were 4 crisp envelopes. He explained his experiment. He was giving each of them an envelope containing a certified check for $1 million. "You have 24 hours, he said, his voice even, to use it on something you believe holds true value. The eyes of his three glamorous guests widened with a mixture of shock and exhilaration. Elena, however, took a half step back as if the box were hot. She shook her head, protesting quietly that she couldn't accept, that it wasn't right because she was his employee. Julian insisted gently, explaining that for the next 24 hours, she wasn't an employee of the foundation. She was simply Elena, a woman free to make her own choice. The four women left the penthouse with entirely different emotions swirling within them. Three were already mentally allocating the funds, their minds racing with possibilities. One, however, was about to demonstrate to Julian Thorne what it truly meant to possess something of value. Isabella departed the building with the check clutched in her hand, her heart pounding with adrenaline. In her mind, a list of acquisitions was already taking shape. Her first stop was a private viewing at Sotheby's, where she placed a winning bid of $450,000 on a rare sculpture she had coveted for her personal collection for months. From there, she was chauffeured to a renowned jeweler on Madison Avenue, where she acquired a vintage emerald necklace for another $300,000. It was, in her mind, a flawless investment. In the afternoon, she visited a private couture house on Madison Avenue, commissioning 5 bespoke gowns for the upcoming gala season for $150,000. The day ended with her final $100,000, which she used to acquire a bold new piece from a rising artist for her gallery, an acquisition that would bring her both profit and prestige. Her total expenditure, exactly $1 million. Victoria, meanwhile, took a more strategic approach. As a seasoned CEO, she viewed this opportunity as seed capital for her own empire. Her first stop was not a store, but the office of a real estate attorney, where she placed a $500,000 down payment on a stunning penthouse in a new Hudson Yards development, an intelligent leveraging of capital. In the afternoon, she met with a private dealer, acquiring a rare Patek Philippe watch and several investment-grade diamonds she knew would appreciate over time, for a total of $300,000. She completed her day by wiring the remaining $200,000 to a cutting-edge AI startup she had been monitoring, securing an early-stage position. Her total investment, a precisely allocated $1 million. For Chloe, these 24 hours were a fantasy brought to life. She began with a whirlwind shopping spree across Fifth Avenue, hitting Gucci, Chanel, and Prada, emerging with dozens of bags, shoes, and outfits. She then ordered a complete set of limited edition Louis Vuitton luggage. In the afternoon, she booked the presidential suite at the Mandarin Oriental for a month, paying the $100,000 deposit up front. That evening, she threw a lavish impromptu party at a Soho rooftop bar, spending $80,000 on champagne and a celebrity DJ. Before the night was over, she had purchased a diamond-encrusted Rolex online for $120,000 and booked a 2-week villa stay in the Maldives for $80,000. She had spent nearly every last cent. Elena, however, just stood on the pavement outside the skyscraper for 20 minutes, staring at the crisp envelope in her hand as if it were an alien object. She had never even owned a credit card. Every purchase she had ever made was with cash she had earned, counted and recounted to the last penny to support her family in Brooklyn. Her first reaction was not joy or excitement. It was pure, unadulterated panic. How could she spend someone else's money? The thought terrified her. But then she remembered Julian's words. For 24 hours, she was not an employee. She was simply Elena, tasked with finding true value. And suddenly, she knew exactly what that was. Her first stop was Mount Sinai Hospital, where she walked into the financial administration office, her heart pounding. Her father needed an experimental treatment that their insurance wouldn't cover, with a waiting list in the public system that stretched for years. With a series of wire transfers, Elena established a private fund to cover the entire course of his treatment, starting the following week. It cost $150,000 to give her father his health back. From there, she went to the bursar's office at her brother's university and paid his entire 4-year tuition and housing fees, another $120,000 to guarantee him a future free from the crushing weight of student debt. In the afternoon, she met with a real estate agent in her family's Brooklyn neighborhood. She put a $500,000 down payment on a small 2-family house, the kind her parents had always dreamed of but could never afford. It was enough to secure the mortgage and ensure they would have a home of their own, forever safe from eviction. That evening, on her way home, she made 2 final stops. She bought a large cake and pastries from their favorite local bakery, a small luxury of $200 to celebrate with her family. Then, she stepped into a small, independent bookstore and bought a hardcover collection of poetry she had always wanted, which cost $35. It was the only thing she bought for herself. Total spent $770,235 that night. While the other 3 women slept in their new clothes, dreaming of assets and acquisitions, Elena lay awake, crying tears of pure joy, picturing the look of relief on her father's face. She now possessed something more precious than any diamond: the security and happiness of the people she loved most in the world. Julian had his financial security team monitor the use of each check in real time. The reports that flooded his inbox kept him awake all night. There were no alerts from Chanel or Sotheby's under Elena's name. Instead, he saw massive wire transfers to a hospital, a university, and a title company. The last transaction, a tiny charge at a bookstore in Brooklyn, struck him with more force than any of the million-dollar purchases, moving him in a way he had never experienced before. Julian Thorne did not sleep that night. The detailed reports on the 4 women spending lay on his desk, but the file on Elena had shaken him more profoundly than any event in his life. At 7 a.m., he was dressed and in his car, being driven across the bridge from Manhattan to a quiet, working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn where Elena lived. When she opened the door, still in sweatpants with her eyes swollen from tears of happiness, she was speechless to find her employer standing there. Julian looked at her, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Without the quiet formality of her work clothes, Elena had a natural, serene beauty that struck him. But more than that, he saw a purity in her eyes that he had forgotten could exist. The apartment was small but immaculate, the walls adorned with photos of her family. Julian explained that he had monitored how she used the check. Elena's face fell, assuming she had done something wrong. But he quickly stopped her. She hadn't spent too much, he explained. She had spent almost nothing. In 24 hours, Elena had used the money not for herself, but to secure her father's health, to fund her brother's education, and to give her family the safety of a home. The only thing she had bought for herself was a $35 book of poetry. When Julian finally asked what she thought of him, Elena looked him directly in the eye for the first time, not as an employee, but as an equal. Her words were direct. "Honestly, I feel sorry for you." He was taken aback. "You live in a palace in the sky," she continued, "but you always seem so alone. You have everything, but I've never seen you truly smile. I hear the calls you get, the women who say they love you, and I see the sadness on your face the moment you hang up." Those words struck Julian like arrows to the heart. It was the first time anyone had told him the truth without a filter, without an agenda. He realized Elena had understood it was a test, but instead of playing the game and throwing herself at his money, she had simply done what any person with a good heart would do. She helped her family. Julian knew the other 3 women had, between them, spent nearly $3 million on themselves. Elena had used less than $1 million to build a future for the people she loved, to save the lives and futures of others. He knelt before Elena and asked her to marry him. When she protested, saying she was just a girl from Brooklyn who worked for his foundation, he replied that she was the only person who saw him as a man, not as a bank vault. He then kissed her, and in that small, humble apartment, the most genuine love Julian Thorne had ever known was born. That evening, the final confrontation of the experiment took place in Julian's penthouse. The 4 women presented themselves at 8 p.m., but the atmosphere was entirely different from the day before. Julian wore a serious expression, and Elena was seated by his side, a beautiful diamond engagement ring sparkling on her finger under the light of the chandelier. Isabel was the first to notice the ring, and her practiced smile instantly vanished. When she demanded an explanation, Julian announced directly that Elena was his fiancée and that they would be married within the month. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian stood up and began to pace before them, holding a tablet with the financial reports. Before explaining why he had chosen Elena, he wanted to review how they had each defined true value. He turned to Isabella first, reminding her that she had spent her $1 million on sculpture, a necklace, couture gowns, and art for her gallery. "All for yourself," he said calmly. "All for your personal pleasure and prestige. When I gave you that check, your first thought was of the beautiful things you could finally acquire. Next," he faced Victoria, "you were smarter than the others. You used $1 million to secure a multi-million-dollar property, acquire hard assets, and invest in a startup. You saw the check as a business opportunity, a chance to multiply the money you were given. You saw a transaction, not a gesture from the heart." Finally, he looked at Chloe, whose smile had long since faded. "You spent nearly $1 million in 24 hours on bags, shoes, parties, and travel. You treated that check like it was your birthday and Christmas all rolled into one, buying every fantasy you've ever had without a single thought for anyone else." Julian stopped in front of Elena, who looked at him with eyes full of love and concern. He explained to the others that Elena had spent over $770,000, not on jewelry or bags or luxury cars, but to pay for her father's life-saving medical treatments, her brother's university tuition, and a secure home for her parents. The only thing she had purchased for herself was a $35 book of poetry. Julian's voice began to tremble with an emotion none of the other women had ever seen. When I saw the report of her spending, he confessed, I cried. I cried because, for the first time in decades, I had met a woman who thought of others before herself. I cried because she made me realize that real love might still exist, even though I had long since stopped believing in it. Isabella shot to her feet, furious. This was a cruel experiment. You made us believe we were important to you. Julian's gaze hardened. You were important, he retorted, but you never once asked how I was, if I was happy, if I needed anything. Elena, on the other hand, noticed everything. She learned how I take my coffee. She remembered the names of my favorite authors. She sensed that I hated Monday morning meetings and would always leave a small, thoughtful note on my desk. When Victoria objected, saying, Julian, she's a sweet girl, but you come from different worlds, he simply shook his head and took Elena's hand. We have in common the only thing that truly matters. We love each other for who we are, not for what we can give each other. He then thanked the 3 women for participating in his experiment, explaining that the funds they received were a one-time gift. The purchases they had made were theirs to keep as a farewell present. When Chloe began to sob, protesting that she truly did love him, Julian was direct. No, Chloe, you love the idea of me, and that is not the same thing at all. She loved the idea of being Julian Thorne's wife, he thought. She loved the first-class travel and the Cartier diamonds, but she didn't love the man. One by one, the 3 women left the penthouse. Isabella and Victoria with cold anger, Chloe with desperate tears. When the elevator doors finally closed, Julian and Elena were left alone in the grand salon, which for the first time in years did not feel empty. Elena asked if he was truly sure about what he was doing, and Julian replied that he had spent 20 years looking for love in all the wrong places. Now that I finally found it, he said, taking her hands, I'm never letting it go. In that moment, he understood that his true treasure wasn't the $3.5 billion in his portfolio, but the heart of gold belonging to the woman who had chosen to love him for who he was, not for what he possessed. The months that followed were the most intense and joyful of Julian's life. Organizing a wedding with Elena was a completely different experience from his previous ones. There were no 6-figure wedding planners or debates about destination venues. Elena wanted a simple ceremony in her home parish in Brooklyn, surrounded by the people who truly loved them. The first problem, however, was Elena's family. When she called her parents to tell them about the engagement, their reaction was one of total disbelief and worry. How could their daughter, a quiet girl from Brooklyn, be marrying one of the richest men in New York? Julian decided to fly to Brooklyn to meet his future in-laws properly. He arrived without a security detail, not in a luxury car, but in a simple sedan, dressed in jeans and a plain white shirt. When he knocked on the door of the small house that Elena had helped secure, it was her father who opened it, his eyes wide with shock at seeing the famous billionaire on his doorstep. It was the beginning of a conversation that lasted the entire night. Julian told Elena's parents the full story of how she had won his heart with her purity of spirit and of the incredible generosity she showed when he gave her the check, using it to save her family instead of buying a single thing for herself. Elena's parents understood that this incredibly wealthy man truly loved their daughter when they saw his eyes well up with tears as he told them how she prepared his coffee each morning, how she had learned his taste, and how she had managed to fill his cold, museum-like home with a warmth it had never known. That night, before Julian left, Elena's father had a private conversation with him. He told Julian plainly that if he ever hurt his daughter, he would personally come looking for him, billionaire or not. Julian replied with absolute sincerity that if he ever caused her pain, her father would have to get in line, because he would be the first one to never forgive himself. The wedding was held 6 months later in the small Brooklyn church where Elena had been baptized. She wore her mother's wedding dress, simple and elegant, which had been beautifully altered by a neighborhood seamstress. Julian wore a simple dark charcoal suit. There were only 50 guests. Elena's family from Brooklyn, the few true friends Julian had, and some colleagues who sincerely respected him. There were no reporters, no society photographers, and no famous faces. Only people who truly loved them. During the ceremony, when the priest asked Julian if he would take Elena as his wife, his voice trembled with emotion as he promised to love and protect her for all the days of his life. When it was Elena's turn, she looked him in the eyes and said that he had given her the chance to save her family, But more importantly, he had given her the chance to love and be loved in return. The reception was held at a classic Italian restaurant in their neighborhood, organized by Elena with the help of her mother and aunts. There was authentic, homemade food, a live band playing old songs, and joyful dancing that lasted until dawn. That night, after the last guest had departed and Julian and Elena were finally alone in the penthouse, he looked at his wife, still in disbelief that he found a happiness so profound in such an unexpected way. He finally understood that his true wealth was not in his bank accounts, but in the heart of gold of the woman who had chosen to love the man, not for what he had, but for who he was. Elena gently caressed his face, explaining that he was a good man who had worked his entire life, who had built himself up from nothing, who had suffered and learned to appreciate the things that were real. The fact that he had so much money didn't make him different from her own father, who had always worked honestly to support his family. And on that June night, in the penthouse that for years had been only a display of wealth, a true family was finally born, built on authentic love and mutual respect. 2 years after the wedding that had caused a stir in New York society, for its simplicity, Julian and Elena were living a life neither of them had imagined possible. The Park Avenue penthouse had been transformed from a coal museum into a home filled with life and warmth. Elena had not changed her character, despite having become one of the wealthiest women in the city. She continued to wake up early to prepare Julian's coffee, just the way he liked it. She continued to personally look after their home, and she continued to send a portion of her monthly allowance to support her family in Brooklyn. Julian had discovered joys he never knew existed. He woke up happy every morning, knowing Elena was there. He had learned to cook traditional Italian food with her on Sundays. He had started reading classic novels. He had even learned a few Italian phrases to speak with his in-laws. The biggest change, however, was in how he managed his business. Influenced by Elena's social awareness, Julian had transformed his family's foundation. He redirected its focus from funding art galleries to creating tangible opportunities in New York's outer boroughs. He opened 3 vocational training centers in Brooklyn and the Bronx, hiring hundreds of people at fair, living wages. But the greatest joy of all arrived one evening when Elena announced that she was pregnant. Julian burst into tears at the sight of the pregnancy test, realizing that he was about to have the family he had always dreamed of without even knowing it. During the 9 months of her pregnancy, Elena did something that moved the high society of New York. She refused to give birth in an expensive private clinic, choosing instead to go to the public hospital in Brooklyn, where she herself had been born, to demonstrate that even the children of the wealthy could be born where everyone else is. Their son, named after his maternal grandfather, was born on a March morning in a standard room at the Brooklyn hospital, surrounded by the love of his parents and maternal grandparents, who couldn't stop crying with joy. Julian, who had held Elena's hand through the entire birth, understood in that moment what it truly meant to be rich. It wasn't the billions in the bank that made him fortunate, but the child crying in his arms and the woman who looked at him with eyes full of love. 6 months after their son's birth, Julian made a decision that shocked the financial world. He announced he would be donating 90% of his personal fortune to charity, keeping only what was necessary to ensure a comfortable life for his family. During the press conference, he explained that money doesn't create happiness, but love does. And I, he said, have enough love to be rich for the rest of my life. Elena stood by his side during the announcement, holding their baby boy. When the journalist asked what she thought of her husband's decision, she replied with the simplicity that had always characterized her. Julian always had everything he needed to be happy. He just decided to share the excess with those who need it. The Thorne Ross Foundation soon became one of the most important charitable organizations in the country, building community centers in underserved neighborhoods and funding scholarships for deserving students from low-income families.